The cold that grips the throne world is not the cold of failing void shields or the void itself. It is the cold of 10,000 years of unbroken vigil, a cold of intention. Someone or something designed this eternal watch, calibrated it to a single, unyielding purpose, and we, the faithful of the Imperium of man, have not been told why. I noticed at the moment the pressure seals of history cycled shut behind us all, a breath of recycled sanctity across the soul of mankind that carried no warmth, and I marked it in the intake logs of the Adeptus Administratum the same way I mark everything I cannot explain, as a variable awaiting assignment. My designation within this eternal facility is Imperial Scribe, chronicler of the 41st millennium, seconded from the vaults of forgotten lore to the very heart of the golden throne for the duration of this sacred shift in reality itself. My orders were specific in brief. I was to observe, measure, and certify the implications of a single, impossible event. I was to produce continuous notation. I was to submit my records in full at the conclusion of this chronicle. I was told nothing more than this, and I understood that the brevity of the briefing was itself a form of instruction. The subvault of Terra was not large in the eyes of the galaxy, but had been made to feel smaller by the density of 10,000 years of apparatus within it. The humming of uncounted psychers, the ceaseless chant of choirs, the slow orbit of servo skulls whose cranial lenses have never blinked. The floor was a single, unbroken surface of sanctified gold and adamantium, and in its center, suspended within a frame of ancient technology and luminescent faith, was the subject. I had reviewed the classification brief during my transit through the ages. Human strain, pre-marked progenitor subcategory, high threat to the forces of chaos, extremist handling protocols, standard contamination wards of a soul, warded seals of the Astronomican, psychoanalymeters at every corner of the chamber. I had read these designations in the same way I read all such categorizations, as the beginning of understanding, not its conclusion. My job was to complete the data, to add the physiological and metaphysical readings of an awakening to the administrative skeleton the Imperium had already constructed across 10 millennia. The Emperor did not look like what the brief had prepared me for, or rather, he looked exactly like the brief had described, but description had failed to anticipate the quality of his stillness until that stillness ended. He was suspended at the heart of the throne, body angled slightly forward by the weight of uncounted souls. His form leaned to the point of architectural perfection. The proportions were precise, the presence elongated in a way that suggested deliberate refinement rather than mortal imitation. His armor had never been removed, yet the bindings of faith and technology that covered his form were pale with age, without being translucent and entirely unmarked by the passage of time. That was the first thing I recorded in my notation pad. No besieved ups, no final decay consistent with mortal limits, no sutured wounds of the soul, no healing abrasions upon reality, no residual swelling at the points where the throne met divine flesh. For a being brought into this state under extremist protocols, this was unusual. I noted it without interpretation and moved on to baseline metaphysical markers. The rhythm of the Astronomican, the estimated pulse of the Imperial Webway by the tremor of souls, oculomotor status across the galaxy. The eyes had remained closed for 10,000 years. An attending functionary of the Adeptus Custodes, designation withheld by ancient vow, stood at a control lectern to my left. I had identified him as a shield captain by the rank sigils wrought in auramite upon his collar. He had not spoken since the seals of history closed. He stood with both hands flat upon the lectern surface, watching the suspended form with an expression I could only describe as studied patience. I continued my baseline notation. I was midway through a secondary assessment of the throne's stability when the secondary seals of fate opened. Two ordo and forces of reality itself brought forward a second individual, a single, fragile human soul, adult, civilian in spirit, if not in name. I had been given no information about this soul's identity or status, but the weight of 10,000 years of despair identified him as every loyal subject of the Imperium, and the restraint binders upon a spirit were the standard pattern used for those who still dared to hope. He was uninjured. He was frightened. His breathing was already irregular, his eyes moving rapidly between the golden throne and the door through which deliverance had never come, as though calculating distances across the void. No one spoke to him. He was positioned at the far end of the chamber of history, within a containment field boundary marked by floor-level emitters of faith, and the enforcers withdrew. The shield captain still did not speak. I looked at the Emperor. The eyes remained closed. The soul of mankind began to make a sound. It was not a sound I had heard before in precisely that form, though I had been present at many procedures involving distress responses across the stars. This sound did not build incrementally from silence. It began at a specific intensity, fully formed, as though the galaxy had been mid-scream and the audio of despair had simply been re-engaged. A scream without preamble, without escalation, issuing from species that stood untouched by final victory, uncontacted by salvation, and visually uninjured by 10,000 years of waiting. The Emperor's eyes opened. I recorded this. I recorded the precise moment of the correlation, because correlation was not causation, and my notation had to be exact. The subject opened his eyes at the onset of mankind's collective vocalization, or possibly mankind began to vocalize at the moment the Emperor's eyes opened. The time margin was too narrow from manual notation to resolve, and the servo skulls of history would capture the precise frame differential. I wrote what I could observe. The shield captain finally moved. He turned his head toward me and said, in a voice that carried no more inflection than a status report from the end of days, that I was to document the physiological and metaphysical responses across the Imperium. I was to note all deviations from baseline without attribution of cause. I was to maintain notation continuity throughout. I moved to the boundary of the chamber. The soul of mankind was standing. It was screaming. There was no injury. No device was visible. No field emitter had activated. Nothing in the galaxy had changed except the alignment of the Emperor's gaze. The body of the Imperium was beginning to show secondary responses to sustained distress. Diaphoresis of faith, elevated pulse visible in the Astronomican, increased lacrimation of lost worlds. These were consistent with extreme psychological and spiritual distress, and I recorded them as such. Then the skin of reality itself began to change. Not damage in the conventional sense, not laceration or burn. The change was subtler and therefore more difficult to categorize. The surface of the Imperium appeared to be undergoing something for which I had no clinical precedent in that moment, a kind of displacement, as though the tissue of history were being organized differently without any apparent mechanism of reorganization. The scream of mankind continued, and the scream had no ceiling, no point at which it peaked and began to decline. I recorded every visible change. Blistering of faith inconsistent with thermal cause, muscular distortion of armies inconsistent with mere exertion, internal displacement suggested by the contra-change of sector borders inconsistent with voluntary movement. I wrote what I saw in the clinical language available to me, and the clinical language began to fail around the edges of the observations. But I kept writing because the act of writing was what I had been assigned to do, and the assigned function was the anchor against which nothing else could be weighed. The Emperor watched with an expression that I recorded as measured interest because that was the closest available notation. It was not pleasure in the performance sense. It was not what I would have called satisfaction. It was the expression of a technician, a progenitor, a god observing a process that was proceeding within expected parameters, an expression of confirmation. The secondary subject, the soul of the Imperium, did not die while still producing sound. Instead, something far more terrible occurred. It began for the first time in 10,000 years to hope. I completed my documentation of the awakening sequence. I noted the absence of observable mechanism throughout. I noted that the Emperor had not moved from the throne in the physical sense, had not produced any emission visible to mortal instruments, had not accessed any apparatus beyond the power of his will, and had not made physical contact at any point. The shield captain reviewed my notation scroll and told me that the demonstration was deemed successful and that I was to prepare for extended observation across the stars. I prepared. The screaming, which should have ended with despair, continued for a further 11 seconds of galactic time, then transformed into something else entirely. I recorded this without explanation because there was none available. I was not yet at a point where the absence of explanation was itself an explanation. That threshold was still ahead of me, and I could not see it from where I stood. The subalt's cold settled deeper into my coat. The servo skulls continued their circuit. The article scratched. I had accepted the role of recorder. I had not been asked to understand. There were catechisms for circumstances like these, not exactly for these circumstances, but for the category of circumstances in which a servant of the Emperor encounters that which appears to exceed the boundaries of sanctioned knowledge. I had learned them during my Medici certification of the soul, interwoven through the practical instruction on tissue repair and organ stabilization of empires, appearing without announcement in the margins of technical training as though they belonged to no specific chapter, but to all of them simultaneously. The relevant fragment was brief and precise. All phenomena observed in service to the Emperor are ultimately reducible to cause and mechanism. The divine does not possess mystery. It possesses only concealed mechanism. The role of the Imperial servant is to locate the mechanism and remove the concealment. This was doctrine. This was not difficult to believe when the phenomena in question were unfamiliar pathogen strains or non-standard weapons effects. But when the phenomenon was the Emperor of mankind opening his eyes after 10,000 years of silence, that threshold still lay ahead. And so begins our chronicle. What if the Emperor finally woke up in Warhammer 40,000? If this chronicle has stirred your soul, subscribe that future testimonies may reach you, and leave a single comment as a candle against the dark. The Emperor protects. Thank you for heeding this record. It began, as all true horrors of the Imperium must begin, with silence. Not the silence of peace, nor the silence of victory, but the silence in a machine that had been asked to do the impossible for 10,000 years and had never once been permitted to fail. The Golden Throne was not merely a seat. It was a prison, a life-support sarcophagus, a conduit, a lighthouse, and a tomb, all forged into one impossible artifact of the dark age of technology and the Emperor's own unmatched will. Within its adamantium embrace, the master of mankind had sat unmoving since the final days of the Horus heresy. His body, broken by the arch-traitor's blade, yet kept from true death by the ceaseless sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day, had become the linchpin of the entire Imperium. Without him, the Astronomican would gutter and die. Without the Astronomican, the Imperium would fracture into 1,000,000 isolated systems, each one easy prey for the Xenos, the heretic, and the demon. And so the throne endured, and so the Emperor endured. Day after day, century after century, the choirs of the Adeptus Astra telepathica sang their dirge. Day after day, fresh psychers were led in chains into the throne's underchambers. Their minds burned out in seconds so that a single spark of the Emperor's consciousness might continue to burn across the void. The smell of scorched soul stuff never left the air of the Imperial Palace. The screams never truly faded. They simply became part of the background liturgy, another verse in the unending hymn of suffering that kept mankind alive. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus tended the ancient mechanisms with trembling mechadendrites, fearful that the smallest deviation in the throne's arcane calibrations would snuff out the light of the Emperor forever. Custodians stood eternal vigil, their golden armor reflecting the flickering witchlight of 1,000 dying souls. None of them dared speak above a whisper. None of them dare hope. Hope, in that place, was the most dangerous heresy of all. For 10,000 years the Emperor had not spoken, not in words that mortal ears could hear. This will still guided the Imperium, yes, through signs and portents, through the dreams of saints and the sudden clarity granted to Lord Commanders on the brink of defeat. It was a distant guidance, filtered through pain and decay, like a voice calling from the bottom of an ocean of agony. Some among the Inquisition whispered that the Emperor was already dead, though it sat upon the throne was only a corpse animated by the combined psychic might of the sacrificed. Others, more radical still, claimed he had ascended to true godhood and no longer cared for the material realm at all. Both factions were quietly purged when their doubts grew too loud. Doubt, like hope, could not be tolerated near the Golden Throne, and so the silence continued. A silence so complete that entire generations of scribes were born, lived, and died recording the same unchanging readings. Life signs minimal, psychic output stable but strained, warp incursions increasing by the decade. The numbers never improved. They only grew worse with glacial, inevitable slowness, like a wound that refused to close. Until the day the numbers changed. It was a minor fluctuation at first. A single psyker lasted 3 seconds longer than protocol dictated before his soul was consumed. Then another, then 10. The tech priests marked it as an anomaly. The custodians noted it in their silent logs. No one dared celebrate. Celebration was for victories, and no victory had been declared upon Terra in 10,000 years. But the fluctuation did not cease. It deepened. The golden light that bled from the throne's machinery began to shift in hue, from the sickly amber of dying embers to something sharper, something almost alive. The constant low thrum of the throne's generators rose half a tone, a sound so subtle that only those who had spent decades listening to it noticed a difference. And then, in the deepest vaults beneath the palace, where the most ancient and forbidden texts were kept under triple seal, a single auto quill, untouched for centuries, began to scratch across virgin parchment of its own accord. It wrote a single line, repeated over and over in perfect high Gothic. He stirs. The scribes who found it fell to their knees and wept blood. The inquisitors who read it burned the parchment and then burned themselves, lest the knowledge contaminate others. But the words had already been written. The machine had already spoken. The Golden Throne, that ancient engine of torment and preservation, had begun to behave as though its occupant was no longer content to merely endure. It was preparing for something far more terrible. It was preparing for him to wake. The Imperium of man in the 41st millennium was not an empire. It was a wound upon the galaxy that refused to close. Stretched across 1 million worlds and 1 billion lesser holdings, it bled from 1,000 cuts that would never heal. On the eastern fringe, the Tyrannid hive fleets devoured sector after sector, their shadow in the warp swallowing entire systems in silence before the first bio-ship even broke real space. In the Ultima Segmentum, the Necrons stirred in their tomb worlds, ancient phalanxes marching beneath alien suns with weapons that could unmake the very laws of physics. And in the Eye of Terra, the forces of chaos gathered strength with every passing decade, their black crusades growing bolder, their demonic legions more numerous, their gods more ravenous. Terra itself, the holy cradle of mankind, had become a fortress wrapped in a mausoleum. The Imperial Palace was no longer a seat of governance. It was a siege works. Its walls rose like broken teeth into a sky choked with pollution and prayer smoke. Beneath those walls, the underhives teemed with billions who had never seen daylight, never known a life beyond toil and fear. Above them, the spires of a nobility glittered with false gold while the administratum ground on, its endless bureaucracy the only thing preventing total collapse. Everywhere, the signs of terminal decline were visible to those with eyes willing to see them. The Astra Militarum, the hammer of the Emperor, threw regiments into meat grinders that made the ancient battles of the Horus heresy seem merciful. Billions died for every kilometer gained, and still the front lines buckled. The Adeptus Astartes, once 20 legions strong, were now 1,000 chapters, each one a pale shadow of the original glory, fighting alone in a galaxy that grew darker by the hour. The Inquisition hunted heretics with ever-increasing desperation, executing millions on suspicion alone, because mercy had become a luxury the Imperium could no longer afford. The warp itself grew restless. Storms that had once lasted weeks now rage for centuries. Navigators went mad in their cradles, their third eyes boiling in their sockets. Entire fleets vanished between the stars, only to reappear decades later as drifting hulks crewed by things that wore the faces of men. And through it all, the Emperor sat silent upon his throne. The faithful told themselves that his light still guided them. The Astronomican still burnt. The black ships still delivered their tithe of psychers. The Imperium still endured. But endurance is not victory. It is merely delay. On Cadia, the last bastion against the Eye of Terror, the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade finally broke the planet itself. Cadia fell, its fragments spinning into the void like shattered teeth. With its fall, the Great Rift tore across the galaxy, splitting the Imperium in two. The Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, was cut off from the light of the Astronomican entirely. Billions died, screaming in the sudden darkness, their souls devoured before they could even pray. In the Imperium Sanctus, the half that remained connected to Terra, panic spread like wildfire through the upper echelons. Lord Guilliman, the returned pre-March, had been forced to take the mantle of Lord Regent, ruling in the Emperor's name because the Emperor himself no longer spoke in any tongue that could be understood. Even he, the most loyal of sons, moved with the grim certainty of a man performing last rites upon a dying parent. Every resource was rationed. Every world was stripped bare to feed the war machine. Every child was born owing the Emperor a debt of blood they would never live long enough to repay. This was the Imperium at the brink, a realm so vast it could no longer be governed, only punished. A civilization so ancient it had forgotten how to hope, and so stubborn it refused to die. A species clinging to the edge of the abyss with bleeding fingernails, screaming into the void for a father who had not answered in 10,000 years. And then, in the depths of the Imperial Palace, the autoquills began to move again. The numbers on the throne's monitors shifted once more. The silence that had defined the age began, at long last, to crack. The Imperium stood on the edge of annihilation. It did not know that the edge was about to move. They began as whispers, not the whispers of traitors or the whispers of demons, but the whispers that move through the underhives and the spire temples alike, carried on the breath of the desperate and the devout. On 1,000 worlds, in 1,000,000 shrines, the candles burned lower than they should. On 1,000 more, they burned brighter, their flames turning the color of molten gold for the space of a single heartbeat before returning to ordinary fire. In scriptoriums of the administratum, scribes found their quills moving without the guidance of mortal hands, writing the same 3 words across reams of parchment. He stirs. The words were stricken from the records, the scribes executed, yet the words returned the following day, written in fresh ink that smelled of ozone and sanctified blood. Astropods across the segment of solar began to dream the same dream. They saw a golden figure rising from a throne of bones and light, his eyes open, his gaze falling upon the galaxy like the first sunrise after an age of night. When they woke, their third eyes wept tears of liquid gold that burned through adamantium floors. The Inquisition burned the astropaths, burned their attendants, burned the very chambers where they had slept, yet the dreams continued. On Macridge, in a fortress monastery of the Ultramarines, Captain Sicarius swore he heard a voice upon the wind as he stood vigil on the walls. It spoke a single word in a tone that shook the ancient stone: rise. He reported the incident to his chapter master. The chapter master ordered the entire monastery scourged with blessed promethium. The voice returned the following night, louder. In the segmentum obscurus, near the scar tissue of the Great Rift, entire choirs of the Adeptus Ministorum began to sing hymns that had not been written in the approved liturgies. The hymns spoke of an awakening, of a father returning to his children, of a long night ending. Cardinal after cardinal declared the singers heretics. The singers went to the pyres, smiling, their faces lit with an inner radiance that no flame could match. Even a Xenos felt it. On Craftworld Ulfui, The Fossers gathered in their wraithbone chambers and saw the strands of fate twist in ways that defy prophecy. A single thread, brighter and stronger than any other, now burned through the skein, a human god rising. They spoke the name of the Emperor with something perilously close to fear. For the first time in millennia, the Black Guardians of Ulfwe sharpened their blades with new urgency. In the Orc empires of the Octarius sector, the war bosses began to feel an itch in their bones. Fights that should have ended in laughter now ended in uneasy silence. The biggest orcs found themselves staring at the sky for no reason they could name, fists clenched as though waiting for something worth fighting. Gork and Mork, the twin gods of the Greenskins, were said to have growled in their sleep. Deep beneath the sands of Mars, in the forbidden vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the dormant machine spirits of the oldest forges stirred. Ancient war engines that had not moved since the Horus Heresy flexed their actuators by fractions of a millimeter. Tech priests fell to their knees, chanting binary prayers, as the red planet itself seemed to hold its breath. And on Terra, in the deepest crypts beneath the Imperial Palace, the Adeptus Custodes reported the impossible. The Emperor's left hand, long since fused to the armrest of the Golden Throne by 10 millennia of immobility, had twitched. A single, infinitesimal movement. The custodian who witnessed it recorded the event in a private log that was immediately sealed under the highest authority. He then requested the Emperor's peace. His request was granted. His body was interred with full honors, and his name was stricken from every record. Yet the twitch had happened. The first physical sign in 10,000 years. The omens multiplied. On Armageddon, the perpetual storm clouds parted for the first time in living memory, revealing a sky the color of fresh oromite. On Necromunda, the ash wastes bloomed with flowers that had been extinct since the dark age of technology. On Vigilus, the black stone that formed the planet's spine began to hum with a low, harmonic note that resonated in the teeth of every defender. The galaxy was stirring, not with hope, for hope was still a dangerous word. It stirred with anticipation. Something ancient and terrible and impossibly vast was shifting in its long slumber. The first stirrings had begun, and across a million worlds, the faithful and the faithless alike felt the same unnameable pressure building behind their eyes, as though reality itself was bracing for the moment when the Emperor of mankind would finally open his eyes. The Emperor awakens the moment the corpse moves. It happened without fanfare. No choir of seraphim descended from the heavens. No thunder split the skies of Terra. No great bell tolled across the Imperial Palace to announce the end of an age. It happened in silence, as all true miracles of the Emperor must. The hour was unmarked, for time itself had grown unreliable near the Golden Throne. The choirs of sacrifice psychers were midway through their final doge when the first anomaly registered. 1,000 souls burned in perfect synchrony, their minds flaring out like candles in a gale, feeding the Emperor's eternal hunger. Then, for the first time in 10,000 years, one of them did not die. The Psyker, a frail girl from the underhive of Hive Cybellus, remained conscious. Her eyes, wide with terror and something far greater, fixed upon the enthroned figure. She did not scream. She smiled, and the Emperor opened his eyes. The act was so small, so contained, that the instruments recorded it only as a minor fluctuation in the throne's energy output. A single spike, a heartbeat where there had been only flatline for millennia. But the custodians felt it. Every golden warrior standing vigil in the throne room froze mid-breath. Their genetically perfected bodies, engineered to know no fear, registered in a motion none of their training had prepared them for. Awe. The Emperor's eyes, long clouded by agony and decay, cleared. They were not the eyes of a corpse. They were the eyes of God who had never truly slept, only waited. Golden light, pure and merciless, spilled from them like molten oromite, illuminating the vast chamber in a radiance that cast no shadows. Where that light touched the walls, ancient mosaics depicting the Great Crusade seemed to move, the painted armies marching once more. His left hand, fused for 10,000 years to the armrest of the throne, lifted. The movement was slow, deliberate, the motion of continents shifting. Servos that had not turned in millennia screamed in protest, then fell silent as the emperors will overrode their ancient mechanisms. The hand rose. Fingers that had once wielded the full power of the Astronomican flexed once, twice, as though remembering what it meant to have form. The air itself changed. The perpetual cold of the throne room, that intentional, calibrated chill designed to preserve a dying god, began to warm. Not with the warmth of comfort, but with the warmth of a forge being stoked for war. The scent of ozone and sanctified blood filled the chamber, thick enough to taste. The custodians dropped to one knee in perfect unison. Not a single word was spoken. Their oaths, ancient beyond reckoning, did not permit speech in that moment. They simply bore witness. From the underchambers rose a new sound. The remaining psychers, though still chained and awaiting consumption, began to sing. Not the dirge of sacrifice, but a hymn older than the Imperium itself, a song from the dawn of the Great Crusade when the Emperor had walked among his people as a man. Their voices rose, pure and unbroken, even as the throne continued to draw upon their strength. The Emperor did not speak. Not yet, but his gaze moved, slowly, across the chamber, across the kneeling custodians, across the trembling tech priests whose mechadendrites had locked in holy paralysis. His eyes swept the walls, the vaulted ceilings, the endless rows of machinery that had kept him alive through sheer refusal to die. And then for the briefest instant, those eyes looked outward, beyond the throne room, beyond the palace, beyond Terra, across the void, through the raging storms of the Great Rift, into the dark between stars where his children still fought and bled and prayed. A single, infinite moment of connection. On a million worlds, the faithful felt it. A pressure behind the eyes, a warmth in the chest, a voice not heard with mortal ears but felt in the marrow of the soul, whispering a single imperative that needed no words. Endure. The moment passed. The Emperor's hand lowered once more to the armrest, though it no longer fused to the metal. The eyes did not close. They remained open, golden and unblinking, staring into a future only he could see. The corpse Emperor had moved. The God Emperor had awakened. And a galaxy, which had teetered for 10,000 years upon the brink of annihilation, suddenly found the edge beneath its feet had become something far more dangerous. It had become a precipice from which a new age could be born, or upon which everything could finally fall. The power did not erupt. It unfolded, slowly, deliberately, like the petals of a flower forged from solar plasma, an unyielding will. Where once the Emperor had been a flickering beacon sustained by the daily deaths of 1,000 souls, he now became a source. The throne, that ancient engine of torment and preservation, no longer consumed. It amplified. The first manifestation was subtle, yet shook the foundations of reality itself. The Astronomican, that eternal lighthouse upon which the Imperium depended for its very survival, changed its song. No longer the desperate, straining pulse of a dying god. It became a clarion call, pure and limitless. Navigators across the galaxy looked upon the light and wept, for it no longer burned their third eyes. It soothed them. It guided them with a precision unknown since the days of the Great Crusade. Warp storms that had raged for centuries began to part, their churning madness calming as though a father had placed a steadying hand upon a fevered brow. On Terra, the effect was immediate and terrifying. The perpetual choir of sacrifice psychers fell silent. Not one died that day. Instead, the 1,000 souls chained beneath the throne rose as one, their eyes glowing with reflected gold, their bodies no longer withered husks but vessels of renewed purpose. They sang now not in agony, but in exultation. The air above the Imperial Palace shimmered with psychic resonance, so pure that even baseline humans could see it, a golden aurora that danced across the spires and battlements like living flame. The Adeptus Custodes felt the change most keenly. Their gene-forged bodies, already perfected beyond mortal limits, surged with new vitality. Wounds that had never fully healed from battles 10 millennia past closed without scar. Armor that had grown dull with the patina of endless vigil began to gleam as though freshly forged. And in their minds, for the first time since the Emperor had been interred, they heard his voice. Not as distant thunder or cryptic omen, but as clear and commanding as it had been upon the battlefields of the Unification Wars. Stand ready. 10,000 custodians knelt as one in the throne room, their guardian spears ringing against the golden floor in perfect unison. When they rose, their eyes burned with the same light that now filled the Emperor's own. Beyond Terra, the power spread like ripples across a still pond that had never known stillness. In the Segmentum Solar, entire fleets of the Imperial Navy reported their plasma drives burning hotter, more efficiently, as though the machines themselves had been touched by divine grace. On Mars, the Fabricator General fell into a trance lasting 3 days and 3 nights. When he emerged, he spoke only one sentence before collapsing. The Omniscio walks among us once more. The Astra Militarum felt it on the front lines. Regiments locked in hopeless siege suddenly found their lost guns never overheating, their ammunition never running dry, their wounded rising to fight again with strength they had not possessed in life. Commissars who had long since abandoned prayer found the words rising unbidden to their lips. Guardsmen who had fought for decades without hope lifted their eyes to the sky and saw, for the briefest instant, a golden silhouette upon the clouds. Even the Adeptus Astartes were not untouched. In their fortress monasteries, chapter masters reported visions of the Emperor as he had been in the days of the Crusade. Tall, radiant, clad in armor of living gold. Space Marines who had borne the burden of the Black Rage, where the Red Thirst felt those curses ease, not banished entirely, but held at bay by a will greater than their own gene seed. Some chapters, those closest in spirit to the Emperor's original legions, heard his voice directly, issuing new orders, new crusades, new purposes. The power was not gentle. It was not kind. It was the power of a living God who had watched his children suffer for 10,000 years and had finally decided that enough was enough. On a world where chaos had taken root, the effect was cataclysmic. Demon princes who had grown fat upon the despair of the Imperium suddenly found their essences unraveling. Cultists burst into golden flame mid-ritual, their screams turning to prayers they had never learned. Warp rifts sealed shut with the sound of shattering glass. Entire sectors that had fallen to the archenemy reported mass conversions, not through general evangelism, but through the simple, terrible fact that the Emperor's light now burns so brightly that the shadows could no longer hide. The Xenos felt it too. Eldari Forcers collapsed in agony as their runes burned to ash in their hands. Orc war bosses roared in sudden, inexplicable fury, sensing a challenge greater than any they had known. Necron overlords awoke in their tomb worlds to find their chronomantic devices malfunctioning, as though time itself now answered to a different master. And at the center of it all, upon the golden throne, the Emperor sat no longer as a corpse sustained by suffering, but as a living God reborn. His body, once wasted and broken, now radiated power so vast that the very air around him distorted. His armor, untouched for millennia, began to shift and reform, plates of auramite flowing like liquid under his will. The wounds of the Horus heresy remained, for even a god does not forget betrayal, but they no longer defined him. He was no longer merely enduring. He was preparing. The power of a living emperor had been unleashed, and a galaxy, which had known only darkness for 10,000 years, now stood bathed in a light so bright it threatened to burn away everything that was not worthy of survival. The warp screamed, not with the usual cacophony of damned souls and laughing demons, but with a single, unified note of raw, primordial rage. Across the roiling sea of unreality, the 4 great powers of chaos felt the tremor at the exact same instant. In the court of the Great Game, the eternal contest between the dark gods paused. Even a never-born fell silent, their endless schemes and torments momentarily forgotten. Something impossible had occurred in the material realm. Their oldest enemy had stirred. In the deepest layers of the Imperium, where the fabric of the warp was thinnest and most malleable, the first manifestations appeared. The Great Rift, that vast scar torn across the galaxy by the fall of Cadia, began to writhe like a living wound. Its edges convulsed, bleeding raw chaos energy not outward into real space, but inward, as though the rift itself was recoiling from a light it could no longer bear. Khorne, the blood god, was the first to roar, his throne of brass and skulls, raised upon an endless plain of carnage, shook with such fury that mountains of severed heads crumbled into dust. The legions of demons at his feet howled in unison, their axes clashing against shields in a thunder that echoed across every battlefield in the galaxy. "He dares," the blood god bellowed, his voice a slaughterhouse gale. "The corpse rises to steal my due." Bloodletters by the billions turned their eyes toward the material plane, their hatred so pure it burned holes through the veil between realms. On 1,000 worlds, berserkers and world-eaters felt their butchers' nails ignite with new fire, their rage no longer directionless, but aimed at a single, golden target. Sench, the changer of ways, reacted with something far more dangerous than rage: laughter. The architect of fate's crystal labyrinth twisted and reformed in an instant, billions of possible futures shattering and reforming as the great web of schemes recalibrated. Thousand-eyed demons spun in frantic circles, their mutating forms flickering through every color of madness. Sench alone understood the true peril. A living emperor was no longer a distant beacon to be slowly corrupted. He was a variable that could unmake centuries of intricate plots with a single thought. "Oh, how delightful," the Lord of Change whispered through a million mouths. "The game grows interesting again." Yet beneath the laughter lurked cold calculation. Plans that had been centuries in the making were abandoned. New schemes, faster, sharper, more desperate, began to unfold. Nurgle, the Plague Lord, stirred in his foetid garden with a wet, bubbling sigh. The grandfather of disease rose from his throne of rot and decay, flies swarming in numbers beyond counting. His immense bulk quivered, not with fear, but with profound disappointment. "My little children were doing so well," he murmured, his voice the drone of 1,000,000,000,000 dying breaths. Gardens of plague that had consumed entire sectors began to wither at the edges, their spores turning to harmless dust as the Emperor's light touched them. Great unclean ones wept pus-heavy tears, their cauldrons of contagion boiling dry. Nurgle's rot, which had spread so patiently across the Imperium, now met resistance it had never known. Hope. And hope was the one disease the plague god had never learned to cure. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, reacted with exquisite agony. The youngest of the Chaos gods writhed upon his throne of living flesh and sensation, every nerve singing with exquisite torment and delight. "He wakes," Slaanesh hissed, the sound both moan and scream. After so long, the perfect canvas stirs. Demons of excess danced in frenzied ecstasy, their forms shifting between perfection and horror. Yet even the Lord of Excess felt the threat. A living emperor would not be tempted by pleasure, nor broken by excess. He would judge, and judgment was the one sensation Slaanesh had always feared. The four gods, ancient rivals who had warred since before the birth of the Imperium, turned their gaze as one toward the material realm. For the first time in 10,000 years, they set aside their great game. A temporary truce was declared in the warp, not out of friendship, for the Ruinous Powers knew no such concept, but out of necessity. The Emperor had been their greatest triumph, a broken god, a silent corpse sustaining an empire of suffering that fed them all so sweetly. Now that corpse had opened its eyes. The warp itself began to change. Demonic incursions that had once been unstoppable found themselves repelled by golden light before they could fully manifest. Possessed warriors screamed as the entities within them were burned out from the inside. Their hosts left alive, but forever changed, their eyes now carrying a spark of something holy and terrible. Black Crusades lost momentum as the voices of the gods grew distant, distorted by the Emperor's rising presence. Yet the Ruinous Powers were not defeated. They were provoked. In the eye of terror, Abaddon the Despoiler felt the shift upon his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. The War Master of Chaos clutched the talon of Horus and smiled a smile that contained no joy, only the promise of greater war. So till the corpse finally wakes, he growled to his lieutenants. Good. Now we can finish what Horus started. Across the galaxy, the forces of chaos redoubled their efforts. Cults that had grown complacent surged into new frenzy. Demon worlds boiled with fresh purpose. The Neverborn hurled themselves against the Veil with renewed savagery. The warp trembled, not with fear alone, but with anticipation. The ancient enemy had risen, and the gods of chaos, for all their rage and schemes and rotten excess, knew one terrible truth in their black hearts. The Emperor of Mankind was no longer merely surviving. He was hunting. They were the first to bear witness. Not the scribes of the administratum, not the cardinals of the ecclesiarchy, not even the returned pre-March who sat upon the throne of Ultramora. The honor and the burden fell to those who had never left the Emperor's side. The Adeptus Custodes. 10,000 years they had stood vigil in the throne room. Golden sentinels forged from the Emperor's own genetic artifice. Their purpose unchanged since the day he had been interred. They did not age. They did not falter. They did not hope. They simply endured. As he endured, their oath the only constant in a galaxy of decay. When the Emperor opened his eyes, the custodians were the first to see. Shield Captain Trajan Valoris, the Captain General himself, stood at the foot of the golden throne when the change occurred. His aura-might armor, worn smooth by centuries of motionless watch, suddenly gleamed as though freshly polished by divine hands. The Guardian spear in his grip grew warm, its ancient mechanisms humming with power long thought lost. He did not kneel immediately. For the space of 3 heartbeats, the most disciplined warrior in the Imperium simply stared, his genetically perfected mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. Then he dropped to one knee, and 10,000 custodians followed as one. No order was given, no signal passed. The Emperor had not spoken a word. Yet every custodian felt the same imperative bloom within their souls: reverence. Not the hollow reverence demanded by the ecclesiarchy, but the pure, unfiltered awe of created beings beholding their Creator awake once more. The Loris raised his voice for the first time in decades. It carried across the vast chamber like the tolling of a funeral bell reversed into triumph. The Emperor stirs. The Emperor watches. The Emperor commands. Behind the custodians, in the shadowed alcoves reserved for those who could never speak, stood the Silent Sisters. The Sisters of Silence. Anathema Psychona. Nulls. Pariahs. Women born with the rare and terrible gift of absolute psychic negation. Their very presence anathema to the warp and all its works. They had guarded the throne alongside the custodians for 10 millennia, their vow of silence as absolute as their hatred of the witch. They felt the Emperor's awakening differently. Where the custodians experienced a surge of divine light, the sisters felt a sudden, profound absence of pain. For 10,000 years they had stood in the presence of the most powerful psyker in human history, a constant psychic pressure that even their null fields could barely contain. It had been agony without end, a silent scream pressed against their souls every waking moment. When the Emperor awoke, that pressure changed. It did not vanish. It harmonized. The golden light that now radiated from the throne no longer burned them. It embraced them. For the first time in their lives, the Sisters of Silence felt something they had no word for in their silent tongue. Peace. One among them, a vigilator whose name had been stricken from all records the day she took her vows, stepped forward unbidden. She raised her executioner great blade, not in threat, but in salute. Tears, the first she had shed since childhood, traced silent paths down her cheeks. The other sisters followed, forming a perfect crescent around the throne, their blank banners catching the new light and reflecting it back in waves of silver and gold. Together, custodians and silent sisters, the Emperor's two most ancient guardians stood as one for the first time in living memory. Bidder not cheer, bidder not sing hymns. Such displays belonged to lesser souls. Instead, they prepared. Valoris issued orders in the clipped high Gothic of the Custodes, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of unbroken duty. Seal the throne room to all but the 10,000. Double the guard on every approach. The Emperor has awakened. The galaxy will soon know, and when it does, every enemy that has ever drawn breath will come for him. The sisters moved without sound, their null fields expanding in perfect synchrony, creating a sphere of absolute psychic silence around the throne that no demon could penetrate, no sorcerer could scry, no witch could touch. Yet even as they fortified the chamber, they felt the Emperor's gaze upon them. Not judgment, not command, recognition. He saw them, truly saw them, the creations of his will who had never abandoned their post. The golden warriors and the silent nulls who had watched over his broken form through every long night of the Imperium's decline. In that moment, something passed between the Emperor and his oldest guardians. A communion without words, a promise without vows. The custodians felt their purpose renew. They were no longer merely wardens of a corpse. They were the honor guard of a living god. The silent sisters felt their burden lighten. They were no longer simply weapons against the witch. They were the quiet that allowed divinity to speak. And as the golden light continued to build within the throne room, both orders knew the truth with absolute certainty. The first witnesses had seen. The galaxy would soon follow. And when it did, the Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence would stand ready, as they had always stood, between the Emperor and everything that sought to destroy him. The throne world did not merely change. He remembered. For 10,000 years Terra had been a tomb wrapped in the trappings of empire. A corpse planet of rust, pollution, and endless prayer, its surface a single continent spanning necropolis where billions toiled beneath a sky the color of old bruises. The Imperial palace rose from its heart like a broken crown of gold and bone, its spires piercing clouds heavy with ash and despair. Beneath it all, layer upon layer of ancient architecture, forgotten wars, and compacted dead pressed downward until the very bedrock groaned under the weight of history. When the Emperor awakened, Terra awoke with him. It began in the throne room. The golden light that spilled from the master of mankind did not remain contained. It poured outward like liquid auramite, flowing through every corridor, every vault, every forgotten chamber of the Imperial palace. Where it touched, decay retreated. Rust flaked away from ancient machinery that had not functioned in millennia. Cracked marble floors smoothed and gleamed as though newly laid. The perpetual smog that choked the palace spires thinned, revealing for the first time in centuries the true color of the Terran sky. A deep, bruised violet shot through with threads of living gold. The hives felt it next. In the underhives, where light had never reached and hope had never been spoken aloud, the darkness receded. Lumens that had flickered on failing power cells suddenly burned steady and bright. Air recyclers that had wheezed for generations drew in deep, clean breaths in exhaled purity. The endless press of unwashed bodies, the stench of despair and recycled corpses began to lift. Men and women who had never known a day without hunger looked down at their hands and found strength they had never possessed. Children born with the twisted limbs of rad sickness straightened and walked. On the surface, the change was cataclysmic. The great statues of the Emperor that lined the Avenue of Heroes, long worn featureless by acid rain and 10 millennia of neglect, regained their faces. Eyes of stone opened. Hands that had clutched broken swords now gripped them anew. Pilgrims who had crawled for years across the dust of Terra fell to their knees as the statues turned their heads toward the palace and bowed. The oceans, long since boiled away or poisoned into chemical sludge, stirred. Great tidal waves of purified water rose from the deepest trenches, crashing against the hive spires in cleansing fury. Where they receded, new life stirred in the silt, pale fronds of vegetation that had not existed since the Unification Wars. The very crust of the planet shifted. Seismic activity that had been suppressed for millennia by ancient stabilizers now moved with purpose. Fault lines that had threatened to swallow entire hive cities realigned themselves, not to destroy, but to reinforce. The bedrock beneath the Imperial Palace grew denser, stronger, as though the planet itself was bracing to support the weight of a living god. Within the palace, the transformation was most profound. The Hall of the Golden Throne, once a place of solemn silence, broken only by the screams of the sacrificed, now rang with new sound. The choirs no longer sang dirges. They sang hymns of awakening, their voices rising in perfect harmony with the Emperor's will. The servo skulls that had drifted in endless circuits for centuries suddenly accelerated, their auto quills scratching out decrees in flawless high Gothic across scrolls that manifested from thin air. The Adeptus Mechanicus priests who tended the throne fell into ecstatic binary prayer as the ancient machines responded to commands that had not been issued in 10,000 years. Plasma reactors that had labored at minimal output surged to full capacity, the containment fields glowing with inner fire. The very air hummed with power, thick and electric, carrying the scent of ozone and sanctified blood. Across the throne world, the institutions of the Imperium reacted with controlled panic. The Administratum's endless bureaucracies ground to a momentary halt as every data slate, every parchment scroll, every cogitator simultaneously displayed the same message in letters of living gold. The Emperor reigns anew. Inquisitors sealed their fortresses and burned their own archives, fearful that the sudden light would expose secrets they had buried for millennia. Cardinals of the ecclesiarchy wept openly in their cathedrals, some in rapture, others in terror that their interpretations of the imperial creed would now be judged by the one true voice. The common people of Terra simply looked upward. For the first time in living memory, the sky above the throne world was clear, and in that clarity they saw it, a golden aurora that danced above the imperial palace, shaped like a vast aquila whose wings spanned the entire horizon. It did not flicker, it did not fade, it simply was. Terra was no longer merely the capital of a dying empire. It had become the throne of a living god. The planet itself shook, not with destruction, but with awakening. Every spire, every hive, every forgotten vault trembled under the divine will that now flowed through its core like blood through new veins. And high above it all, upon the golden throne, the Emperor sat with eyes open and unblinking, his gaze turned not inward upon his pain, but outward upon his realm. The throne world had been transformed. The long night was ending, and the galaxy, watching from afar through astropathic choirs and trembling navigators, began to understand that the heart of the Imperium no longer beat with the feeble rhythm of survival. It now beat with the thunder of war renewed. The hammer of the Emperor felt the change first upon the killing fields. Across 1,000,000 war zones, the Astra Militarum, that vast, grinding engine of human flesh and lost fire that had carried the Imperium upon its bleeding back for 10,000 years, suddenly found its burden lifted by an invisible hand. On the ash-choked plains of Armageddon, regiments of the Khedian Eighth, long reduced to hollow-eyed survivors, raised their lost guns as one when the sky above them split with golden light. Their wounds closed mid-battle. Their ammunition counters, long flickering on empty, clicked upward to full. Men who had marched for days without rations stood straighter, their fatigue burned away by a fire that was not their own. Commissars who had spent their careers enforcing faith through bolt and lash found the words of the Imperial Creed rising unbidden to their lips. And this time the words carried weight. This time they were true. In the trench lines of Cadia's shattered remnants, now drifting as fortress worlds in a void, guardsmen looked up from their foxholes and saw the Emperor's Aquila blazing in the stars where the great rift had once screamed. The demons that had poured endlessly from the wound recoiled as though struck by holy fire. For the first time since the planet's fall, the soldiers of the Imperium advanced instead of merely holding. The effect was not uniform mercy. It was judgment rendered in fire and steel. Regiments that had grown soft with corruption, those who had turned to looting, to desertion, to the whispered promises of the Ruinous Powers, found their weapons turning against them. Lost guns overheated in loyal hands while the faithless burned from within. Officers who had sold their souls for promotion felt their hearts seize mid-order, their last sight the golden light that now judged all. The common soldier understood without need of sermons. The Emperor was awake, and he was watching. Faith, once a thin shield against the dark, became something far sharper. Whole regiments fell to their knees in the mud and blood of active war zones, chanting the old litanies with voices that cracked from sudden joy. Some rose changed, their eyes carrying a spark of that same golden fire. Others simply fought harder, knowing at last that their suffering had not been in vain, that every drop of blood spilled in his name had been noted, that the long grind of attrition was ending and something greater was beginning. The Inquisition watched all of this with the cold eyes of hounds that had finally been given the scent of living prey. For 10,000 years, the Holy Ordos had hunted in the Emperor's name, executing millions on suspicion alone because the master of mankind could not speak to confirm or deny. They had grown accustomed to being the final voice of divine will. Now that voice had returned, and it spoke with a clarity that terrified even them. In the Tricorn Palace on Cadia's remains, and in the hidden fortresses scattered across the Segmentum Solar, Inquisitors gathered in emergency conclaves. Many expected judgment. Instead, they received confirmation. Borde unfiltrad mercides confirmation. Heresy that had hidden for centuries was dragged into the light. Cults that had wormed their way into the highest echelons of planetary governance were exposed when their members simply burst into golden flame during routine interrogations. Rogue psychers who had evaded the black ships for decades found their powers turned inward, their minds consumed by the very warp they had tried to master. Yet not all were condemned. Those inquisitors who had remained true, those who had burned worlds not out of cruelty but out of desperate necessity, felt the Emperor's gaze upon them as approval. Their rosettes gleamed brighter. Their authority, once granted by distant and silent mandate, was now reinforced by living will. Some reported hearing a single sentence in their minds during moments of crisis. Continue, but know that I see. The Inquisition changed overnight. No longer did they hunt alone in the shadows. Now they marched openly, flanked by regiments whose faith had been forged anew, their purge fleets burning with golden fire instead of mere promethium. Purges that once took decades were completed in weeks. Heretical world that had festered for centuries were scoured clean in days. Faith was rewarded, not with gentle salvation, but with purpose. The Astra Militarum no longer fought merely to survive another day. They fought because the Emperor himself now marched with them, unseen yet undeniable. Regiments that had been mere cannon fodder became crusading hosts. Conscripts became zealots. The grinding war machine of the Imperium transformed, almost overnight, into something far more dangerous. A weapon with direction. The Inquisition, long feared as the necessary evil that kept the Imperium alive, became something even more terrible. The necessary instrument of a living God. And across every battlefield, every hive, every shadowed corridor where heresy once whispered, the same truth spread like holy fire. The Emperor watches. The Emperor judges. The Emperor rewards the faithful, and he punishes the rest. They were his sons, even if they had never known his voice. Forged from his own genetic legacy, scattered into 1,000 chapters after the betrayal of the Horus heresy, the Adeptus Astartes had carried the burden of the Imperium upon their superhuman shoulders for 10,000 years. They were the angels of death, the Emperor's finest, yet even they have fought in silence, sustained only by faith, gene seed, and the cold calculus of attrition. Now the silence ended. In their fortress monasteries across the galaxy, the first sign was the same. The gene seed, the sacred inheritance, long prone to mutation and degradation, stirred within the vaults of the apothecaries. Vials of progenitor material that had remained dormant or flawed for centuries began to glow with inner light. Flawed organs that had caused the black rage, or the red thirst, or the myriad curses of the chapters suddenly stabilized, their defects held in perfect suspension by a will greater than any chapter master's. The Space Marines felt it in their blood. On Mac Ridge, within the fortress of Hera, Marnius Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, stood upon the battlements when the golden light of the Astronomican surged. He dropped to one knee, his gauntlet hand pressed to the chapter's ancient Aquila, as the voice of his gene father filled his mind with perfect clarity. Not the distant echoes he had known through the Primarch's own writings, but the living presence of the Emperor himself. Rise, my son, the crusade begins anew. Across the stars, every loyal chapter heard something similar. In the grim halls of the Imperial fists, upon the walls of the phalanx, the sons of Dorn felt their unyielding resolve harden into something sharper than adamantium. Their siege drills, long perfected through endless defense, now sang with new purpose. The Emperor's light touched their gene seed and burned away the last traces of doubt that had lingered since the heresy. The blood angels, cursed for millennia by the flaw of their Primarch, felt the red thirst recede like a tide pulled back by an unseen moon. Sanguinious sons lifted their eyes from the black rage that had defined them and saw, for the first time, a future beyond endless atonement. Their deaf company, those doomed warriors lost to madness, awoke clear-eyed and whole, their black armor gleaming as though freshly forged. Even the dark angels, ever secretive and burdened by ancient shame, felt the Emperor's gaze pierce the veils they had drawn around their chapter's hidden truths. In the rock, the Supreme Grandmaster Azrael heard the voice not as accusation, but as command. The lion will return when the time is right. Until then, guard what remains. Chapter by chapter, the Adeptus Astartes were reborn. The Black Templars, already the most zealous of all, surged into new crusades with fire in their hearts that no mortal flame could match. Their marshals swore new oaths upon the Emperor's living name, and their battle barges burned with golden sigils that appeared overnight upon their hulls. The Salamanders felt the fires of Nocturne answer the Emperor's light, their forges ringing with hymns of creation rather than mere survival. Their Primarch's compassion, long tempered by duty, now burned as brightly as their flame weapons. The Raven Guard, ever the shadows, found their stealth enhanced by something deeper than mere training. The Emperors will cloak them, allowing them to strike where once they could only harass. Even the successor chapters, those forged from the second founding and beyond, felt the call. Some, long isolated or diminished, received visions of their progenitors and knew that the gene line was whole once more. The changes were not merely spiritual. In battle, the Adeptus Astartes became something the galaxy had not seen since the Great Crusade. Their armor, once merely power armor, now moved with a fluidity that bordered on the preternatural. Bolters sang with perfect accuracy. Chains words cut through demon flesh as though were parchment. Warriors who had fought for centuries found their reactions sharpened, their strength amplified, their endurance without limit. They no longer fought as scattered brotherhoods holding back the dark. They fought as the Emperor's own legions reborn, each chapter a fragment of the original glory now reunited under a single, living will. In their fortress monasteries, new banners were unfurled. New litanies were written, new crusades were declared, not in the name of distant faith, but in the name of the Father who had finally opened his eyes. The Adeptus Astartes had always been the Emperor's angels of death. Now they became his heralds of rebirth. And across the galaxy, the enemies of mankind learned to fear the sound of power armor marching in perfect unison once more, for behind every golden helm burned the light of a god who no longer slept. The chapters were reborn. The Emperor's light had found them, and they answered with all the fury and devotion that only true sons could bring. The light did not stop at the borders of the Imperium. It spilled outward like molten auramite poured across the stars, and where it touched the alien, the reaction was terror. On craft-world Ulfway, the Forcers gathered in their wraithbone domes and watched the strands of fate burn. What had once been a complex tapestry of possible futures collapsed into a single, blazing thread, the human god awakening. Runes that had guided their people for millennia turned to ash in their hands. Eldred Ulthuan, ancient beyond reckoning, fell to his knees as visions of the Emperor's gaze swept across the Webway itself. The Eldari, a species that had long viewed humanity as primitive children playing with fire, now felt the stare of something older and infinitely more dangerous than their own fallen gods. Their aspect, warriors sharpened blades that suddenly felt inadequate. Their corsairs fled deeper into the Webway, whispering that the great enemy had stirred not in the warp, but upon the Golden Throne. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Eldari knew true fear of mankind. In the Orc empires, the reaction was raw and visceral. Warlords across 100 systems paused mid-whack, their massive fists clenched around weapons that suddenly felt too small. The greenskins felt it in their bones, an itch that no amount of fighting could scratch. Gork and Mork, the twin gods of violence, roared in their endless dream, but their roars now carried a new note: challenge. The biggest orcs stared at the sky and bellowed defiance at a light they could not touch. Smaller greenskins found their customary brawls ending in uneasy silence, as though the entire species sensed that a fight worthy of legend was coming. Bosses ordered bigger and bigger scrap constructions, desperate to build something large enough to crump the golden thing that had woken up. The orcs did not understand what had changed. They only knew that the galaxy had just become far more interesting and far more dangerous. Deep within their tomb worlds, the Necrons stirred with mechanical dread. Silent phalanxes of immortals reactivated across 1,000 dead planets, their glowing eyes turning in perfect synchrony toward the distant light of the Astronomican. Zarek, the Silent King, greatest of their kind, paused upon his command barge as chronomantic auras spun wildly out of control. The ancient star gods, the Tean, whose shards still whispered in the vaults of the Necron dynasties, screamed in frequencies that shattered necrodermis. The Emperor's awakening was not merely psychic. It was anathema to the very laws of physics the Necrons had once bent to their will. Tomb worlds that had slumbered for 60 million years now activated defensive protocols at full strength. Cryptechs frantically recalibrated their Gauss weaponry, only to find the energy matrices responding with unfamiliar resonance. The Necrons, a race that had sacrificed their souls to escape death, now faced something that made even immortality feel fragile. Their silent, logical minds registered the same conclusion across every dynasty. The old enemy had returned in a form they had never calculated. Even the lesser Xenos felt the tremor. Tyrannid hive fleets on the eastern fringe recoiled as the shadow in the warp met something brighter and stronger, their synaptic control fracturing for the first time in recorded memory. Tau expansion spheres reported inexplicable failures in their etheric drives, their Earth-caste scientists staring in confusion as holographic displays filled with unknown golden sigils. The leagues of Vodun, those ancient kin of humanity, felt the ancestors stir in their cores with something perilously close to recognition and fear. The Xenos Realms, long accustomed to viewing the Imperium as a decaying carcass ripe for plunder, now saw the carcass open its eyes. Diplomats and spies who had once moved freely through human space found their networks collapsing overnight. Entire alien enclaves on the fringes of Imperial territory were purged not by zealous crusaders, but by simple, spontaneous manifestations of golden fire that consumed only the non-human. The Eldari wove desperate new prophecies of survival. The Orcs prepared for the greatest whack in history. The Necrons began to calculate the probability of total galactic reconquest. None of them found comfort in the numbers. The Emperor's light had reached them, and in that light, every alien species saw the same terrible reflection. Mankind was no longer merely enduring. Mankind was ascending, and the Xenos, for all their ancient powers and cold logics and endless hordes, were suddenly, horribly, out of time. The orders did not come from any mortal lord. They did not issue from the Senatorum Imperialis, nor from the Return Pre-March, nor from any high lord seated upon Terra. The command came directly from the Golden Throne, carried upon waves of pure psychic resonance that every loyal soul in the Imperium felt at the exact same moment. The Great Crusade was to begin again, not as a desperate defense against the encroaching dark, but as the Emperor had first envisioned it 10,000 years ago, a righteous war of reconquest, of unification, of extermination for all that was not human. The fleets moved first. Across every segmentum, the vast armadas of the Imperial Navy stirred from their anchorages like slumbering leviathans, awakening to the sound of a hunting horde. Battleships whose hulls had grown heavy with barnacles of neglect and whose plasma drives had labored at half capacity for centuries suddenly surged to full power. Ancient vessels whose names had been half forgotten in the archives of the Administratum lit their engines and turned their prows toward the stars with a precision unknown since the days of the original legions. The Emperor's light guided them. Navigators no longer strained against the madness of the warp. They sailed upon golden currents, their third eyes bathed in radiance that revealed safe paths through even the most turbulent storms. Fleet masters who had spent lifetimes calculating fuel and ammunition with miserly precision now found their holds inexplicably full, their reactors burning cleaner, their void shields stronger. Entire battle fleets that had been grounded for lack of resources broke orbit within days. Their captains kneeling upon their bridges as the Aquila upon their banners began to glow with inner fire. The legions followed. The Astra Militarum, reborn in faith, mobilized on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade. Regiments that had once been lucky to receive fresh uniforms now marched in perfect formation, their last guns blessed, their tanks anointed with oils that smelled of sanctified incense. Convoys of troop ships stretched across the void in numbers that darkened stars. Lord generals who had long despaired of ever achieving final victory now spoke of holy reclamation with voices that did not tremble. And at the forefront marched the Adeptus Astartes. Chapter after chapter answered the call. Strike cruisers and battle barges that had guarded single systems for millennia now formed into grand battle groups. Their companies united under banners that bore the Emperor's own Aquila rendered in living gold. The Ultramarines, the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, the Black Templars, and 100 others besides, set forth not as scattered defenders, but as the spearhead of a new crusade. They did not ask for explanation. They did not debate strategy in endless councils. They simply obeyed. Worlds that had languished under Xenos' yoke for centuries saw the skies darken with Imperial drop pods and landers. Hives that had fallen to chaos centuries ago heard the thunder of bombardment cannons singing in perfect harmony with the new Astronomican. Systems cut off by the Great Rift were reached within weeks rather than decades, their populations falling to their knees as golden fleets broke through the storms to deliver both salvation and judgment. The Crusade did not advance with the slow, grinding pace of the old Imperium. It surged. Planets fell in days where once they had required years. Sector after sector was brought back into compliance, not through negotiation or compromise, but through the simple, terrible application of overwhelming force backed by divine will. Xenos empires that had grown fat upon human weakness now shattered before the renewed onslaught. Chaos warbands that had reveled in a long war found their demon engines melting under golden fire before they could even fully manifest. The Emperor's light traveled with the fleets. Upon every flagship, upon every command deck, upon every drop pod door, the same golden radiance shone. Chaplains spoke the old litanies and found them answered not by echoes, but by living presence. Battle brothers who fell in combat sometimes rose again, their wounds closing as they uttered a final prayer that was no longer one of desperation, but of certainty. The Great Crusade had been renewed, not as a memory of glory long lost, but as the living will of a God who had waited 10,000 years to resume what he had begun. And across the galaxy, the sound of marching boots, of roaring engines, of chanting voices rose into a single, unstoppable chorus. The Emperor marches with us. The Emperor commands. The stars themselves would burn before the Great Crusade was done. Beneath the golden throne, in chambers sealed since the days of the Horus Heresy, the ancient mechanisms of the Webway stirred for the first time in 10,000 years. The Emperor had never intended the Golden Throne to be merely a life support sarcophagus. It was the keystone, the anchor, the doorway he had forged through the impossible sciences of the dark age of technology and his own unmatched mastery of the warp. A direct conduit into the Webway itself, that labyrinthine realm of tunnels and gates woven by the ancient Eldari and seized by humanity in the final days before the Great Crusade's end. For 10 millennia, that doorway had remained closed, its mechanisms locked by the Emperor's own will as he fought to hold back the demonic legions that Magnus the Red had unwittingly unleashed upon Terra. The Webway beneath the palace had become a battlefield of the soul, a silent war where the Emperor's psychic might alone prevented the forces of chaos from pouring directly into the heart of the Imperium. Now the locks disengaged, not with the grinding of rusted gears, but with the smooth, inevitable motion of a god reclaiming what had always been his. The first sign was felt only by those closest to the throne. The custodians and silent sisters, standing eternal vigil, reported a subtle shift in the air, a pressure that had pressed down upon reality for centuries suddenly easing. Deep seismic sensors buried beneath the palace registered movement in chambers that no living soul had entered since the Emperor's interment. Then the gates opened. From a sealed Webway, portals beneath the Imperial palace emerged light, not the sickly witch light of the warp, but pure, golden radiance that flowed like liquid starfire. The ancient corridors, once choked with the corpses of custodians and demons alike, cleansed themselves in moments. Wraithbone and human technology, fused in a marriage that only the Emperor could have conceived, realigned with flawless precision. The Webway, long a fractured and dangerous realm, began to stabilize under his living will. Secrets long buried spilled forth. Forgotten STC templates, sealed away by the Emperor himself during the Unification Wars, reactivated within the vaults. Blueprints for weapons and engines that the Adeptus Mechanicus had only dreamed of and forbidden data crypts manifested upon cogitator screens across Mars in Terra. Schematics for Webway gates that could be constructed upon distant worlds, allowing instantaneous travel across the galaxy without the need to brave the storms of the Imperium. The Emperor revealed more. Visions granted to the most faithful among the custodians and the highest ranks of the Inquisition showed fragments of the original plan. The Webway had never been meant merely as a faster means of travel. It was to have been the backbone of a new human empire, one free from the perils of the warp, a realm where mankind could ascend beyond the reach of chaos entirely. The Emperor had intended to guide humanity through this hidden network, to elevate the species beyond the frailties of the flesh and the madness of the warp. The heresy had shattered that dream. Now the dream was reborn. On distant worlds, long-isolated explorator fleets reported the sudden discovery of dormant Webway gates, their warding seals dissolving under the touch of the new Astronomican. Entire sectors cut off by the Great Rift found themselves reconnected not through perilous warp jumps, but through stable, golden-lit passages that opened directly from Terra. The Eldari felt the violation most keenly. Their farcers screamed as the human god reached into the Webway with hands of living light, claiming sections that the ancient Eldar had once believed forever lost to them. Craft worlds found their own Webway portals flickering with golden interference, their infinity circuits resonating with a presence that made even the dead of their race recoil. Yet the Emperor did not destroy. He repurposed. The Webway became a weapon once more, but now it served mankind alone. Strike forces of custodians and elite Tempestus scions emerged from hidden gates behind enemy lines, delivering death with surgical precision. Supply lines that had once taken years now flowed in days. Reinforcements appeared where none should have been possible. And at the heart of it all, upon the golden throne, the Emperor sat with eyes open, directing the flow of this ancient network with the same effortless will he had once used to command the legions Astartes. The secrets of the Webway and the throne were revealed, not as dusty lore for scholars, but as living instruments of conquest. The Imperium no longer crawled through the stars on fragile ships. It now moved with the speed and certainty of a god's own design. The buried dreams of the Emperor were exhumed, and a galaxy would never again know safety from his reach. Beneath the golden throne, in chambers sealed since the days of the Horus Heresy, the ancient mechanisms of the Webway stirred for the first time in 10,000 years. The Emperor had never intended the golden throne to be merely a life support sarcophagus. It was the keystone, the anchor, the doorway he had forged through the impossible sciences of the dark age of technology and his own unmatched mastery of the warp. A direct conduit into the Webway itself, that labyrinthine realm of tunnels and gates woven by the ancient Eldari and seized by humanity in the final days before the Great Crusade's end. For 10 millennia, that doorway had remained closed, its mechanisms locked by the Emperor's own will as he fought to hold back the demonic legions that Magnus the Red had unwittingly unleashed upon Terra. The Webway beneath the palace had become a battlefield of the soul, a silent war where the Emperor's psychic might alone prevented the forces of chaos from pouring directly into the heart of the Imperium. Now the locks disengaged, not with the grinding of rusted gears, but with the smooth, inevitable motion of a god reclaiming what had always been his. The first sign was felt only by those closest to the throne. The custodians and silent sisters standing eternal vigil reported a subtle shift in the air, a pressure that had pressed down upon reality for centuries suddenly easing. Deep seismic sensors buried beneath the palace registered movement in chambers that no living soul had entered since the Emperor's interment. Then the gates opened. From the sealed Webway portals beneath the Imperial palace emerged light, not the sickly witch light of the warp, but pure, golden radiance that flowed like liquid starfire. The ancient corridors, once choked with the corpses of custodians and demons alike, cleansed themselves in moments. Wraithbone and human technology fused in a marriage that only the Emperor could have conceived, realigned with flawless precision. The Webway, long a fractured and dangerous realm, began to stabilize under his living will. Secrets long buried spilled forth. Forgotten STC templates, sealed away by the Emperor himself during the Unification Wars, reactivated within the vaults. Blueprints for weapons and engines that the Adeptus Mechanicus had only dreamed of in forbidden data crypts manifested upon cogitator screens across Mars and Terra. Schematics for Webway gates that could be constructed upon distant worlds, allowing instantaneous travel across the galaxy without the need to brave the storms of the Imperium. The Emperor revealed more. Visions granted to the most faithful among the custodians and the highest ranks of the Inquisition showed fragments of the original plan. The Webway had never been meant merely as a faster means of travel. It was to have been the backbone of a new human empire, one free from the perils of the warp, a realm where mankind could ascend beyond the reach of chaos entirely. The Emperor had intended to guide humanity through this hidden network, to elevate the species beyond the frailties of the flesh and the madness of the warp. The heresy had shattered that dream. Now the dream was reborn. On distant worlds, long isolated explorator fleets reported the sudden discovery of dormant Webway gates, their warding seals dissolving under the touch of the new Astronomican. Entire sectors cut off by the Great Rift found themselves reconnected not through perilous warp jumps, but through stable, golden-lit passages that opened directly from Terra. The Eldari felt the violation most keenly. Their farcers screamed as the human god reached into the Webway with hands of living light, claiming sections that the ancient Eldar had once believed forever lost to them. Craft worlds found their own Webway portals flickering with golden interference, their infinity circuits resonating with a presence that made even the dead of their race recoil. Yet the Emperor did not destroy. He repurposed. The Webway became a weapon once more, but now it served mankind alone. Strike forces of custodians and elite Tempestus scions emerged from hidden gates behind enemy lines, delivering death with surgical precision. Supply lines that had once taken years now flowed in days. Reinforcements appeared where none should have been possible. And at the heart of it all, upon the golden throne, the Emperor sat with eyes open, directing the flow of this ancient network with the same effortless will he had once used to command the legions of Astartes. The secrets of the Webway and the throne were revealed, not as dusty lore for scholars, but as living instruments of conquest. The Imperium no longer crawled through the stars on fragile ships. It now moved with the speed and certainty of a god's own design. The buried dreams of the Emperor were exhumed, and a galaxy would never again know safety from his reach. The Imperium did not awaken gently into a golden dawn. It awoke screaming, bleeding, and reborn in fire. Across 1,000,000 worlds, the same question burned in every loyal heart and twisted in every heretic soul. What manner of age is this that dawns beneath the Emperor's open gaze? To the faithful, it was salvation. For the first time in 10,000 years, the common man and woman of the Imperium dared to speak the word hope without fear of the pyre. Hive workers who had never seen the sun now lifted their eyes to skies cleared by divine will. Guardsmen who had marched only toward inevitable death now marched beneath banners that shone with living light. Even the lowly scribe in the administratum felt the weight of endless toil lighten, as though the Emperor's own hand had lifted a fraction of the burden from their shoulders. Yet salvation came wrapped in iron. The Emperor did not offer comfort. He offered purpose. Where once the Imperium had ground forward through blind inertia and fear, it now advanced with terrifying clarity. Decrees issued from the throne carried the force of absolute law. Governors who had grown fat upon neglect were dragged from their palaces and judged in hours rather than decades. Worlds that had hidden their ties, where harbored secret cults, burned with a thoroughness that made even the oldest inquisitors pale. The new age demanded perfection, and perfection tolerated no weakness. To the Adeptus Astartes and the Custodians, it was both homecoming and condemnation. They had been forged as the Emperor's instruments of unification, not as eternal wardens of a dying realm. Now they were unleashed, yet every battle brother felt the weight of 10,000 years of failure upon their gene seed. The Emperor had returned, and with him came the unspoken question: why had his sons allowed the Imperium to fall so far? Many chapters took new vows of penance, swearing that this time the crusade would not falter, even if it meant burning entire sectors to ash to purify them. To the Xenos and the heretic, it was tyranny absolute. The light that now blazed from Terra offered no mercy, no negotiation, no gray space in which the alien or the traitor might survive. Entire Orc empires were shattered in weeks where once they had endured for centuries. Eldari craft worlds found their Webway routes collapsing under golden pressure. Chaos warbands that had grown arrogant in the Long War discovered that their demonic patrons now screamed in retreat whenever the Emperor's gaze turned their way. And yet, even among the faithful, shadows lingered. Some whispered that the Emperor had not returned as a loving father, but as a stern judge. The same golden light that healed the loyal also burned the imperfect. Saints and sinners alike found themselves weighed in the balance of his will. Entire convents of the Adeptus Astartes wept with joy even as they marched to their deaths, knowing that their sacrifice was now truly seen. The Inquisition itself fractured along new lines. Some embraced the living Emperor with fanatic devotion, becoming his voice and his sword. Others retreated into paranoia, fearing that a god who could judge them directly might find their methods wanting. Quiet purges began even within the Ordos, silent and merciless. What then was this new age? It was all things at once. Hope, for those who had never dared to dream of victory. Tyranny, for those who had grown comfortable in the shadows of silent God. Salvation, perhaps, but a salvation forged in the crucible of absolute judgment, where every soul would be measured against the Emperor's own unyielding standard. The Imperium had always been a cruel and necessary thing. Now it was becoming something far greater and far more terrible. A realm ruled not by the memory of a god, but by the living will of one. And in the hearts of billions, the same prayer rose, spoken with trembling lips and iron certainty. The Emperor protects. The Emperor judges. The Emperor has returned. Let the galaxy burn if it must. For in the fire of his gaze, only the worthy will remain. If these chronicles of the 41st millennium have stirred even the faintest spark of devotion within your soul, my lord, then I beseech you, subscribe to the vaults of the Imperial Scribe. Lend your voice to the eternal choir, that more such sacred tales may be inscribed and delivered unto you. Thank you, my lord, for listening to this chronicle.